Well, hello there. Who are you?
This is the Zodiac speaking.
Killing must feel good to God, too. He does it all the time. And are we not created in his image?
We all go a little mad sometimes.
After all, murder is, or should be, an art.
I could kill you now pretty easily. Do some interesting things before anyone showed up.
What are these films you can't wait to look at?
Welcome to the Final Girls podcast and the 10th episode in our series dedicated to on-screen serial killers of horror film and TV history. I'm Anna Bogutska, and if I could, I'd make this entire series about Hannibal Lecter. This episode is the second of a double bill dedicated to the apex mountain of movie serial killers, Dr. Hannibal Lecter. I'm joined once more by author Kirsty Logan, who discussed Silence of the Lambs last week with me, to dive into the grand guignol queer horror opera that is Hannibal. Created by Brian Fuller in 2013, the show stars Mads Mikkelsen and Hugh Dancy as Dr. Hannibal Lecter and Will Graham. It ran for 3 glorious seasons and continues to have a huge, rabid fan base online. Hannibal adapts and remixes the novels by Thomas Harris, giving us a glimpse of Hannibal before he got caught by the FBI, and his intense, all-consuming emotional entanglement with his murder husband Will, who possesses a near supernatural empathy and ability to put himself in the shoes of serial killers. Absolute spoiler warning for the entire episode if you haven't seen Hannibal. And if you haven't, then maybe this conversation will entice you to discover the show. Keep up with all of the other films and TV shows that I'll be covering in this series over on the Final Girls Letterboxd page. And do give the show a review over on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you listen to your shows, because I too would like to host dinner parties like Hannibal's. If you want more non-serial killer content, do head over to our Patreon page, which really is like the internet's version of an invite-only dinner party, where I post bonus reviews and discussions about horror film, TV, and now books too. Not recipes. Not yet, anyway. And with all of that said, please enjoy our take on Hannibal.
Yeah. Oh no, I have notes. I have
oh my
notes.
God, yes. So... let's kick off. We're recording. This is the second installment of our Hannibal Lecter deep dive. We spoke about the movies last week, and now we're talking exclusively about the TV show that ran for 3 glorious seasons and no more.
I mean, I could talk about Hannibal for every day for the rest of my life, honestly, so I'm happy about it.
I mean, so could I, but I think there might be a limit, and also we might end up on some sort of list.
If we're not already.
So let's get into Hannibal, the TV series. Tell me, first of all, when did you come across the show? And, you know, considering the love that you obviously have for the 1991 Silence of the Lambs films, which we covered last episode, what were your expectations of a TV series based on those same characters?
Yeah, I came to it quite late. So yeah, as you said, it was on in 2013. So that was kind of 6 years since we'd had our last bit of Hannibal in Hannibal Rising, which was not a great place to end. But I didn't start watching it until 2019. And I started watching it. I was in Sweden. I was on this writing residency for a month. And if anyone's ever been on any kind of like retreat or residency, you get a bit strange because you're kind of out of your normal routine. You don't see anybody that you know, but you spend a lot of time with people who you've just met, and you kind of get this really intense, extremely temporary friendship with them. So I was on this residency finishing this book, which I had been working on for about 6 years. So I was already like partly losing my mind. And there was this lovely, lovely guy there who was this Icelandic gay 50-year-old romance novel translator. So he translated romance novels into Icelandic, and he was also a poet. And we just really clicked, and we were like thinking, oh, we should watch a TV show, because we were in this like kind of small town in Sweden in the off season. So there's nothing to do, nowhere to go. So in the evenings we were like, oh, let's watch a film or something. But we were so tired from doing our work, we didn't really want a film every night. So I was like, oh, pick a TV show. Saw that Hannibal was on Netflix, and I thought, let's do that. So every night we would watch like 2 to 3 episodes of this after him having translated romance novels all day. And I was writing this horror novel, which I'd been writing for 6 years. And it was a weird time. It was a really weird time. But I could not think of a better person to discover this show with.
I love that. I also really love the specificity of that experience. Did you find that Hannibal bled into the novel you were writing at that time, or you're writing in general?
So much. And in fact, it wasn't until this rewatch that I sort of guiltily realized, oh my God, I've taken so much. Not like specific, so much, not specific lines of dialogue or scenes or anything, but just the vibes, like so much. Like I was finishing off a book, and I can really see how, so the book was called Now She Is Witch, and a lot of it is about this sort of weird push-pull symbiotic relationship between this younger, quite naive girl and this sort of very sexy older woman who's kind of manipulating her for reasons that you discover. And I was like, wonder where I got that from.
Oh my God.
Could it have been Hannibal? And then just look, I'd also started making notes for this Audible audio novel that I did called The Sound at the End, which was really, really different. So the novel was like medieval witches. And then the Audible thing was like modern day radio play set in the Arctic kind of murder mystery thing. But oh my God, I took so much from Hannibal. Like, again, there's this psychologist character who's kind of manipulating everyone through these fucked up therapy sessions. And I also used like in Hannibal, there's this device of a metronome.
Yeah.
That kind of sets off Will having these like little moments where he imagines the crimes. And I used a thing like that as well.
Oh my God.
It's just like,
I was just thinking of Now She Is Witch, because I've read and loved that novel that you wrote, but now having completed another, probably my 3rd Hannibal rewatch, I'm just thinking, oh my God, the dynamic between them is very different. But now that you mention it, I can see it. It's funny how these things can bleed into any creative work, even without you actively kind of trying to be influenced by them.
So much. And I think, well, we'll get way into the TV show, but one of the things I love about it is the way that Will doesn't actually know what he's done. So he doesn't actually know if he is what he considers a good person or not. And I've realized I have used that over and over in my work since then. And like, I don't think anyone would have connected it to Hannibal. Like, I haven't written about a serial killer or a cannibal or anything, but just that sense of, I'm definitely a good person and I definitely know what I have done, unless maybe I don't. And I love that dynamic. And I realized that I very much use that as the basis for The Sound at the End as well. This thing of this person doesn't think that they've done anything, but they're not quite sure. And I just thought, God, it's so influential. Like, it's sort of become in the marrow of me in a way that I didn't really realize until I came back and watched it again.
So you mentioned it a little bit at the start that when the show arrived in 2013, the last we had seen of Hannibal was in Hannibal Rising, which was a flop in every single possible sense, box office wise, artistically, cannibalistically. So where in the culture was Hannibal by the time that the TV series arrived?
I mean, I would have, like I said, I didn't watch it when it first came out, but I'm going to say nobody cared. I'm going to say we weren't interested.
I agree.
Because we'd had so many bad Hannibals, and like Silence of the Lambs, as we know, undeniably fantastic. But that was a long time ago. And we had kind of bad Hannibal after bad Hannibal. So I just think nobody would have been interested. And I actually have to say, like, massive respect to Brian Fuller, the showrunner of Hannibal, because this could so easily have been just a kind of lazy cash grab remake. Like, oh yeah, we all know this character. I'll just get someone in to kind of ham it up, do an Anthony Hopkins impression. But instead, he has made it this gory, lush, kind of art wank, over the top queer opera about murder boyfriends. And I'm like, wow.
Excuse me, murder husbands.
How did you get away with that? Sorry, murder husbands. Sorry, you're right. They're a little murder family, aren't they? Yeah, I'm like, how did you get away with that? So when I was watching this, I thought, I can't believe this was on like broadcast TV at 10 p.m. You just imagine like your auntie sitting down with her little Chardonnay and some crisps. That's what mine does anyway. And being confronted with these murder husbands and this kind of fountains of blood and these sort of like arty murder scenes.
Well, I think it's interesting to consider it in the space of horror, of Hannibal in the culture, which I agree was kind of dead. And to paraphrase Stephen King, who said that all monsters eventually, through constant reinterpretation, lose their pants. Hannibal had lost his pants at this point. We've done the origin story, it didn't work. With the 2 sequels, they were not very good, or at least did not keep up with the brilliance of the Silence of the Lambs. And also horror itself didn't really suit the aesthetic or the vibe of Hannibal the character, neither the ones from the books or the character that we had grown to see on the screen. But I want to say that on TV is where horror was getting really interesting, and also very, very heavily queer coded, because I'm thinking specifically of American Horror Story, and also of True Blood, which does not get the credit it deserves in terms of pushing forward the blood and the sex and the gore on sort of very mainstream. I believe it was FX. No, it was HBO. Of kind of a mainstream TV series with recognizable stars and with tons of great character actors who went full horror. And that had a much more Southern Gothic vibe to it, but it was a lot more aesthetically guided than other horror TV shows were in the past. It wasn't so interested in the spooky, creaky house. It went full bombastic with it. And I want to say that Hannibal, the series, which started in 2013, which is just around the time the True Blood had kind of lost its bearings and was wrapping up. That show started in 2008 and ended in 2014. And here has this very clear aesthetic proposition, which is, this is gourmet horror. This is high-end horror. What, some people have termed elevated horror much later on, around the time that Get Out would come out a few years later. This is that, but in a very traditional kind of way, where everything is tip-top, very snobby, very high-end in every possible way, but it's mostly emanating from the character. Like, this entire show is creating and extending our idea of a character who we have only really seen imprisoned, mostly on the screen. And when he wasn't imprisoned, it was in really bad films that we're kind of going to choose to erase from the canon. But it's really interesting as well. And as I was rewatching it, I was thinking about Mike Flanagan. I don't know if you've seen his Netflix series, The Haunting of Hill House. And
Anna, have I seen it? Come on.
I'm so
it's
sorry.
One of my favorites.
I'm so sorry. I know that sometimes people are divided about the way that he adapts the work of great writers like Shirley Jackson or Poe and whatnot, but it's this kind of like remix approach to a whole body of work as opposed to just one book. And I think this show did it too, and arguably before The Haunting of Hill House, because it's based on the Thomas Harris books rather than the films. So what do you think of it in those terms? Like, how do you think of it as a piece of work that is remixing elements of the different Hannibal books, but also incorporating callbacks and visuals and even pieces of dialogue from The Silence of the Lambs and Hannibal?
That's such a good point. And I hadn't sort of linked him to the Mike Flanagan approach. And I have to say, like, I love that approach. And I would even take it further back, that one of my favorite adaptations is The Virgin Suicides. And I love the book, really love the book. And I also love the film. And they're so different. They're such different beasts. They're such different entities. But they kind of share this, I don't know, this kind of spine, or I keep coming back to like meaty metaphors, this kind of marrow, or like this beating heart that's the same. And that is my favorite kind of adaptation. Like, should I ever be lucky enough to have my work be adapted? Actually, one of my books was optioned, and this was the approach that I kind of requested that they took, is rather than try and do like a faithful adaptation of the book, I want you to take it as a starting off point and then run with it and make it something else. Because I loved Hill House, and I love Hannibal. And I just think it's so much more interesting because the books still exist. We can still go to the books. This in no way changes the content of the books. But also to just take the book and put it on screen, what's the point of that? I think it has to be its own thing. And I don't really like it. You know, people say, oh, it was really faithful to the book. I think, oh, well, okay, I mean, fair enough. But they're completely different things. As a writer, I write books and I write for screen, and they're so different. There's such different approaches, different ways of telling stories. Books are so internal, and screen work is very, very visual. I mean, just on a very basic level. So it just doesn't work. So to me, that is the perfect way to adapt things. And I'm very, very into it. And I have to say, I'm kind of 50-50 on Mike Flanagan. I love half of what I've seen of his, and I can't stand half. And I think, for me anyway, with my little dark gothic heart, he swings too far into sentimentality. And that's another thing I love about Hannibal, is it's not sentimental. It gets kind of cutesy, but in a very, very dark way.
It is sweepingly romantic, though, in
Yes.
one way. Some people have, Santa Barbara or Love Island. I have Hannibal. Like, Hannibal is my go-to operatic romance show.
Yes, there's this line that I just love, and I had to search it out because I was like, oh, I remember like swooning. There's me in Sweden next to this lovely gay Icelandic romance novel translator, and this line, and we both looked at each other and like squeed, basically. We were like, oh my God. The bit where, it's the bit where Will has been imprisoned because they think that he's the Chesapeake Ripper, the killer, right?
Yes.
And then Hannibal does a sort of does a crime to make it clear that it wasn't Will. And Will kind of knows that it was Hannibal, but doesn't want to say that it was Hannibal because then it makes him look worse. And Hannibal says, this killer wrote you a poem. Are you going to let his love go to waste? Oh my God. I swooned.
Stop it. My favorite. Well, I'm sure we'll exchange a lot more quotes because as I was leisurely rewatching the 3 seasons of Hannibal on Netflix in preparation for this, I was just making copious notes by hand. I love this. This is very far into the series in the penultimate episodes where Bedelia, actually talking to Will about Hannibal, says, could he daily feel a stab of hunger for you and find nourishment at the very sight of you? Yes, but do you ache for him?
Is Hannibal in love with me?
Could he daily feel a stab of hunger for you and find nourishment at the very sight of you? Yes. But do you ache for him?
Listen.
And of course he does. Of course he aches for him.
Fuck Bridgerton. And that whole thing that went viral for a hot second. Could you daily feel a stab of hunger for him? Oh my God. Cannot. So.
I know.
I need to fan myself.
And you know what? So a couple of reasons why I love this murder husband dynamic so much is I think this is the dynamic that that Thomas Harris, the author of the books, wanted for Clarice and Hannibal, and it did not work. Nobody thinks that it worked. I defy you to find a single person that's like, yes, you and Clarice and Hannibal got romantically involved. It was great. I totally believed it and loved it. No. It didn't work. But this works. And I think if the books had been written at a different time, maybe Will and Hannibal would have been the ones that kind of had this dynamic. Because I just think this works so well. And it works in a way, like, I've got to say, not a single one of the het relationships in this series, apart from Jack and Bella, not a single one works or feels in any way real. And I think there's a good reason for that. This is a big gay show. And I have to say, I found it such a relief after so many shows that were so queer-baity. And I'm just going to say it, this will probably mean I never get commissioned by the BBC, but BBC Sherlock, I am still so mad about BBC Sherlock and how much Stephen Moffat hates his viewers, and Stephen Moffat's disdain for the audience's desire for a queer relationship, which he baited. You know, he was like, oh, are they boyfriends? I think they're kind of boyfriends. And then as soon as people were like, oh my God, they're boyfriends, he's like, gross. No, they're not boyfriends. So it was just nice to have a show that was like, no, they are very, very openly in love with each other. It didn't feel queer-baity to me.
Let's start by diving straight into the murder-husband dynamic between Hannibal and Will Graham. And let's kind of talk a little bit about how both Hannibal and Will are characterized. Hannibal has been portrayed multiple times on the screen, as has, Will Graham has been portrayed twice before in films, but he was never really much more than an FBI investigator. He is one of the FBI dudes who's trying to forensically piece together the information. He was never really so much of an interesting character, whereas this is very much expanding the character that's on the page in Red Dragon, the book. So, but let's start with Hannibal, because after all, this is his show and this is my podcast, and I want to talk about him. How is he introduced, and what do you make of Mads Mikkelsen's approach to the performance?
I think he is great because he just makes it his own. I don't think at any point he is thinking about Anthony Hopkins or trying to be him, trying to do an impression of him. He just makes the character completely different. And I actually think, as much as I love Anthony Hopkins' performance and can't fault it in any way, I actually think Mads Mikkelsen's performance is probably closer to book Hannibal, because he is so sophisticated, so charming, so handsome. Obviously, it's difficult because in Silence of the Lambs, we only see him when he's extremely restricted because he's been in prison for a long time. And here we meet him and he's free and he can do and eat and wear whatever he likes. But yeah, very, very different. And I absolutely love his performance. I have to say, I thought I was the only person in the world who didn't have daddy issues until I watched Hannibal. And then I was like, Mads Mikkelsen is daddy.
I thought I was the only person in the world who didn't have daddy issues.
Well, Mads Mikkelsen will bring them out.
None of my rabid fancing of Mads Mikkelsen has anything to do with daddy issues, though. I'm gonna separate them.
I'll try and do the same, even though I think I'm kidding myself.
That's really interesting, because I almost disagree with your point about the book Hannibal, because I almost having rewatched these films and read the novels now quite a dense period of time, I really think this performance by Mikkelsen really stands kind of outside of what we've seen Hopkins do on the screen and what exists on the page, because I really do see the book Hannibal very connected to the Hopkins performance, mainly because he's always imprisoned. And I haven't reread Hannibal, which is where he is on the loose, but that is not as successful a novel, and definitely not a successful film. But here we're seeing a very different interpretation, which is a Hannibal Lecter that has not been caught yet, and a Hannibal Lecter that is wildly successful at basically every single pillar of existing as a person in the world, and very good at serial killing as well. And I think there's so much, we're seeing him take so much pleasure in his life, in the way that he has built his life, and even pleasure in his murdering, you know, in the way that he is so clever that he's able to work for the FBI while being the murderer that they're chasing. That is...
Investigate his own crimes that he committed. Yeah.
That is the biggest fucking lol that a character like this can do. And so much of that also is wrapped up into the way that he's designed as a character, right? I was reading this interview with Janice Poon, who is the food stylist that they hired for Hannibal. So she was in charge of like the food presentation and the cooking of everything. And she called him this hot killer fashion god. Like a real GQ man. And this is an interview in GQ. And that makes complete sense. Like the tailoring, the way his hair is cut, the way his apartment looks, where his desk in his office is set. Every single detail of his life is so considered and so deliberately chosen. Not for anyone else, not because he lives alone, he is single, he does all of these different things that are entirely just for his enjoyment and his life, and his own eyes. Like, he's not performing sophistication for anyone else's approval or to elevate himself in society. He is his own society. And I was wondering, and that really comes through in the choice of Mikkelsen, because he is not an American actor. He is Danish, and with apologies to the Dutch listener for confusing in a previous episode Dutch and Danish, Mads Mikkelsen, a fine Danish specimen of a man, has this like continental exoticism almost about him, even in the way that he speaks, in the way that he dresses, the way that he exists in an otherwise quite drab and grey Baltimore. What do you think about Hannibal on the loose in society, about how the show designs his life and the aesthetic of him?
Yeah, I mean, it is he is like something out of a magazine, and like his house is so perfect, you know. In his dining room, he has this wall of plants, and I remember getting really caught up in that and thinking as him as a real person and being like, do you water those plants, Hannibal? Who brought those planters in? Did you pot them all in the soil? Like, you can't imagine him with his little gloves on doing his potting. But I just got really caught up in it and thinking, like, I wonder what his bathroom's like. I wonder what products he uses. Because you just can't imagine him, like, going to the shops. You can't imagine him, like, buying toilet paper.
You know what?
He seems so unreal.
I can tell you exactly what products he's going to use. And I'll add that with a story. I once dated someone, and the first time I went into his apartment, all of his products, every single one, moisturizer, cleanser, dog shampoo, were Aesop. And I genuinely thought
I was going to say Aesop, yes.
I genuinely thought I was going to get murdered, because I think it is psychotic when somebody has everything of a single brand, especially a brand that is like visually associated with being bougie. But I think...
Yeah, and I mean, like, we love Aesop, right? But, like, the hand soap is, like, 60 quid, and you get through about 2 hand soaps a month.
Yeah. But I think that Hannibal would not go for the Instagram bullshit hand soap that is overpriced, by the way. I think he'd go for La Mer moisturizer, which costs about £200 for a 30 milliliter jar. I think that's what he uses.
But then a part of me thinks, I bet it's all like, no, I'm getting so caught up in Hannibal's aesthetics now, but it's not even his on-screen aesthetics. But I wonder if actually what he uses is not even a brand of face cream. It's like made by this like little old lady in Paris who like hand mixes it in her apothecary.
Oh, absolutely. You're so right.
And it's made to his specifications.
I bet he does that. Yeah, he would not buy off-the-shelf products, no matter how expensive they are. He'd order them in with a specific, down to the drops amount of, like, you know, scents that he wants. I think
and they would have some kind of weird, like a calf in utero extract or something. And that he's like, I have to get it in Paris because you can't buy it in the US, it's illegal or something.
There's this moment in season 3 where Hannibal, heartbroken after his breakup with Will, breakup in quotation marks, you know, they're separated.
No quotation marks needed.
Fair enough.
It is a breakup.
He says to Bedelia, he's very upset. He's on a murder spree. You know how, like, we might go to, like, you know, a pub too many times or order too much takeout. Hannibal goes to Italy and murders a whole bunch of people quite savagely. He tells her, and it's a heartbreaking delivery, he says, I've taken off my person suit. And I was wondering, how would you describe Hannibal's person suit?
I want to be able to draw these streets from memory. I want to be able to draw the Palazzo Vecchio and the Duomo.
You won't be coming back here for a very long time.
Memories of Florence will be all I have. Florence is why I became a man. I see my end in my beginning.
Well, I love that you focused in on that moment of like end of season 2, start of season 3, because I think season 2 is when Hannibal kind of tries to have it all. So he tries to be heterosexual, right? He has his fling with women. And he tries to make his little queer murder fam. So he's got Will as his murder husband, and then they have Abigail as their daughter, which was established like way back in episode 2 or something, that they have this kind of paternal feeling towards her. And it doesn't work. It doesn't work out. He's like, I thought I could have my little queer murder fam, and it didn't work. And so he has this massive tantrum and just kills everyone. And then, he's just given up because he's like, I thought I could have it all. You know, I was trying to be heterosexual, but have like my little queer family on the side. Didn't work at all. Yeah. And then in season 3, it's like, he's just given up. He's just given up on all of it. I feel like that's such an interesting turning point for him.
I agree. And, you know, I want to talk a little bit about his relationship with Bedelia, played by Gillian Anderson, who starts off as his therapist and then becomes his beard and Will's therapist in season 3. But let's move on a little bit to Will Graham, Hannibal's.
Oh, one thing I did want to say about Hannibal. So Hannibal, the TV show, even though it's 10 years since it was on, or 10 years since it started, it still has a very active fan community that people post on all the time. Communities, rewatches, everything. The Fannibals, absolutely. Not saying I'm in those groups, except I definitely am.
I am.
And I saw this post the other day. Yeah, good. I saw a post the other day that I thought was so fascinating, and I'm kind of paraphrasing, but it basically said, Hannibal is a terrible person. He does terrible things, but women and gays love him because he is a man who never, across all 3 seasons, no matter what he does, shouts. He never shouts.
He never shouts, you're right.
No.
And also, you know, it's a very quiet show considering how much violence and gore is in it. People rarely yell. And also, and we should maybe say this up top, it's a crime show, a murder show, where there is no sexual violence.
Yes, that's true. Yeah. And I mean, we do have the kind of stereotypical, like, naked dead girl splayed out, but we have just as many naked dead men, or even naked people whose gender is unclear, dead people. So yeah, it doesn't feel sexualized.
So we've spoken about Hannibal, and we'll obviously not stop speaking about him for the next hour probably. But let's talk a little bit about Will Graham, who is supposedly the protagonist of the show, or the hero of the show. How does the show make Will's, and I'm quoting here, very specific way of thinking about things into his pathology or his superpower?
Yeah, I love it. I think Will in this is the kind of human equivalent of that famous Nietzsche quote, if you gaze for long into an abyss, the abyss gazes also into you. that he can get inside the killer's mindset, but that means that the killer is getting into his mind as well. And of course, that begins that it's just he's becoming a little bit too close to these kind of anonymous murderers that he's consulting on for the FBI. And then, of course, it becomes embodied within Hannibal, the literal murderer who gets inside his mind. So I think it works really well. And I think, is it Hannibal that says this? One of the characters says that he has this extreme empathy, which I think is taken from the books, that his level of empathy is so enormous that he can get inside the head of you, me, a murderer, anyone at all. And I quite like the way that he's manipulated in that way, because at first it's pretty obvious that Jack Crawford is using him, much as we have seen him using Clarice in Silence of the Lambs. And he kind of knows that it's doing Will damage, but he thinks it's worth it. He thinks, well, it is damaging this man to make him spend all this time in these killers' mindsets, but he does it anyway. And it's interesting because you kind of think, is that where Hannibal got the idea then, that Will was so not easy to manipulate even, but he was so malleable, and that he would be so easy to make into a force for good, but he's just as easy to make into a force for evil. And I like that. I actually really like the way that the dynamic between Jack and Will works as well. Again, in a way that I think it kind of worked like that for Clarice and Jack, but it just works so much better when it's all men. I just think it really changes the dynamic, because Silence of the Lambs, as we discussed, was so much about the experience of being female and having a female body and existing out in the world. And there are lots of female characters in Hannibal, but I think the fact that the main kind of power triangle is between these three men just works really, really well.
Yeah, I agree. I think kind of the relationship between Clarice and Jack is so heavily influenced by her gender, her youth, her status within the FBI, whereas Will has a certain sassiness to him. He does push Jack quite a lot and is very aggressive towards him, because I think he's well aware that he is a tool and that they want to use him. So he has a certain amount of leverage that he can wield. And you know what? I always go back and forth on not the characters he's written, but the way that he's performed by Hugh Dancy, because he's arguably both one of the most consistent and inconsistent characters. I mean, the most inconsistent character in this is Dr. Alana Bloom, and we'll talk about her later. But Will is so different from season 1 to season 3 that it almost feels like two different characters played quite radically different. And sometimes I think the way that Dancy plays him flirts too much with like going too far into trying to perform an autistic character or an autistically coded character that is at no point diagnosed as autistic. So it's like you're skirting around quite dangerous territory. It's like, are you just taking these kind of traits from people on the spectrum and incorporating them into someone who is maybe flirting with like being a force being a force for good or a force for evil, like you say, which is kind of troublesome, but also he then sometimes abandons that altogether. I find the way that the show is very interested in visualizing and discussing empathy as this almost like all-consuming state of being for him, which is why he so self-isolates a lot and is mostly just surrounded by his collection of stray dogs and stuff, and is at the core of his relationship with Hannibal. But those are kind of my trepidations around it. But the way where I think the show really succeeds, and why particularly the first and second series are so such good fun to watch as well, is because of how the show, through Will and his approach to investigating and understanding serial killers, is so primarily interested in the killer's fantasy, because that's how Will recreates and understands the crime scenes. So in the first and second series in particular, the third one is very much like wrapping up the show, and it's a kind of adapting both a bit of Hannibal Rising and a bit of Hannibal the book and all of Red Dragon in one series. So it's very compressed, but the first two seasons have a lot of like murder of the week type plots, right? Where Hannibal and Will is investigating, Hannibal is consulting Will and sort of like therapizing him, but not really therapizing him. It's the flirting stage, right? And there's so many scenes where he goes to this crime scene, he sees all the mess, and he sort of like his mind does, there's this whooshing thing, right, that the show does. And he recreates, literally undoes the murders and tries to do them again. And that one of the things that he constantly says is, "This is my design," right? He's like trying to understand the fantasy that the killer has. And that's one of the core things in kind of profiling these kinds of murderers, right? That all of these serial killers are trying to recreate a very specific and extensive fantasy that they have in their heads in real life. And obviously it's tremendously destructive, but it creates a really weird dynamic for us with the show, I think, because we're not seeing the murderers do the crime, we're seeing Will see the crime. And we're seeing Will commit the crime as he's recreating it in his mind, kind of with his empathy superpowers. And I was wondering, how do you think that affects our as viewers' relationship with him as our lead, as our entry point into Hannibal?
Such an interesting question. Yeah, because he's kind of set up as this ambiguous character right from the very first scene. Because as you say, the very first scene we see him, his character introduction is that he's at this crime scene, kind of going in his mind, recreating it as if he is the killer. So we already have him kind of set up as a killer right from the very start, even when we know he's working for the FBI, he's a, quote, good guy, he's on the side of good. But we have this sense of like, oh, but I've seen him commit a murder, even if only in his mind. And to be honest, a kind of setup like this would normally really irritate me. Like, there's so many crime of the week shows like it. We mentioned BBC Sherlock, those shows like Lie to Me, which I actually quite like, but it's silly. It is silly. Or, CSI, that's this kind of like magical, what's the word? Like magical forensics.
Yeah. Law and Order. Law and Order SVU, all the spin-offs.
Exactly. Like they're quite silly. The reason I think it, for me, mostly works in Hannibal, the show, is that the entire thing is so heightened. It's so operatic. The way that the characters speak is not the way that people speak. Real people don't say these things. They don't say, what was Bedelia's line? Could you ache for him? People don't say that. They don't speak like that. But the whole thing is so heightened. All the murder scenes are absolutely ridiculous. They're ones where people have flowers coming out of them. People have mushrooms growing out of them. Isn't there one where they're made into like hives for bees?
Yes.
There's ones where they make a big like totem pole on a beach. There's ones where they're kind of laid out in a grain silo so that when you look down from above, it's like a beautiful kind of multicolored iris, like an eye.
Yeah.
Ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. Every single one is like a painting. I do not believe there has been a serial killer in all of history who has done anything like that. Most murders don't occur like that at all. So the fact that the entire thing is kind of so heightened, like all the sets are really stylized. Hannibal's house doesn't look like a real person's house. Even Will's house, which is meant to, I think, be a lot more rustic, it just doesn't look real, because you're like, where's his stuff? Like, where's his loo roll? Where's his loaf of bread? Like, they don't have like a toothbrush. Do you know what I mean? They don't have the kind of normal things that a person would have. So I think that's how it gets away with it, because the entire thing is so stylized and so heightened. And that kind of thing can become quite cloying. And for me, I think it can get like that. Like season 1, as you say, much more procedural. Like there's kind of crime of the week. I find every episode really rewatchable. You've got Hannibal being this kind of master manipulator, bad possessive boyfriend kind of thing. Season 2, For me, it gets a little bit too art wank, a little bit dark. And I don't mean tonally dark. I mean, like, literally, I cannot see what's on the screen because everything is so dark all the time. There's loads of like slow motion. The music gets quite discordant. Season 3, a little bit like watching a very self-serious Edinburgh Fringe show. So it's not perfect by any means. And I think it often loses its way. And I think when you've set up this very heightened, melodramatic, operatic tone, it can get a bit much. But I will say what I love about this show is it's like nothing else. Like there's no other show that has this level of attention to detail. The production design is just, I think it's my favorite production design out of any TV show that I've ever seen. Like, it's just so spot on. I know you mentioned the kind of food styling, but everything about it, like the food, the sets, the colors. Like, I had read this little factoid that every scene has red in it, some element of red, which when I was rewatching, I was like, wow, there is an element of red, and it kind of becomes deeper or paler, almost going into a pink, depending on like what the tone of the scene is. And I just feel like this, to me, so Silence of the Lambs and Hannibal, to me, are the best depictions of this kind of story world. And I think it's because they feel like such passion projects. They feel like somebody really embodied them and inhabited them. Whereas the other Hannibal films that we discussed, and also we haven't even mentioned that there was an attempt to reboot, there was an attempt to do like a Clarice Starling
in
prequel.
2021.
It was just, do you know what? It wasn't terrible, but it wasn't great because it didn't feel passionate. It didn't feel like someone, for whatever reason, I don't know what happened with the production of it, but it just didn't feel like you were peering inside someone's brain the way that this does. And there's just something, I know you called it lightning in a bottle, and to me, that's this show. It's just such a specific thing. And I have no idea how Brian Fuller managed to pull that off, because I would love to have heard some of the production meetings where he's explaining like what the tone is. Like, yes, I'm going to take this beloved property that's kind of lost its way and I'm going to make it a big queer blood opera. And someone at some point must have gone, yeah, love it, I'm into it. And it worked. But I mean, yeah, so I don't think it always works, but see, when it does work, there is just nothing else like it.
I mean, big queer blood opera. Just give me that commission now. But you mentioned the look and the feel of the show, the aesthetics of it all, which I genuinely think, and I think I might have said this before, either privately or even in this conversation, I do think that the show is aesthetically a manifestation of Hannibal. Like, this is, if Hannibal was the showrunner, this would be the show he would make.
Yes.
And what do it has this such distinct, like you mentioned, very gorgeous, very grand, very operatic, very unreal. This is not a TV series that is in any way, either in the way people speak, in the things that happen, or even in the way it depicts food or violence or sex. It is not grounded or tethered to reality at all. What do you think of the way it depicts violence? And possibly here, to make a question slightly bigger, what do you think about it, the way it depicts violence and bodies aesthetically?
Oh yeah, interesting. Yeah, it is interesting what you were saying about the lack of sexual violence and the lack of kind of sexualized victims as well. And I think, yeah, there is quite a lot of violence in this, but in a way, again, even that is so stylized. Like, it really reminds me of kind of a martial arts film in a lot of ways, that it will be, there's lots of like, there's a lot of like spinning around in slow motion. And like, it's always like people getting an artery in their neck cut, so it like sprays out in this kind of like slow-mo scatter of rubies. It is all very stylized. And I don't usually go for things that are violent, I have to say. Like, I'm massive horror girly, but things that are very violent or very much about bodies or kind of damage to bodies, I usually would steer clear. But I don't know, I think because it is so stylized, it just really works for me. It is interesting. Bodies are very much used as objects, which of course I think is very interesting in terms of, we know that Hannibal is a cannibal, right? We know that the main character is a murderer. And I think that's what's really interesting about this, as opposed to maybe Silence of the Lambs, that we didn't know that at the very beginning until we hear his name mentioned and then his backstory is mentioned. But with this, we, the audience, know what the characters don't. And I think that is really very interesting. And I think there are lots of like little kind of wink nudge moments in the early episodes where Hannibal's like, yes, I simply must have you for dinner. Ha ha. And
yes.
I think it's cute. Like I'm into it. I think the later seasons could do with a little bit of that humor. I think it gets a little bit po-faced towards the end.
Well, I was thinking about this as we were watching the show, and again, just really completely consumed by how beautiful it was. And I think, I feel this way about a lot of body horror, that a lot of it, the best of it, can be exquisitely beautiful. And I really rebel against this idea that body horror equals gore, because I wouldn't call Hannibal a gory show, but there is a lot of bodies in very unreal post-mortem situations. And I think, there are these murder tableaus, right? They're there to be exhibited. They constantly use kind of this artful language. And it's going to sound very art wanky, what I'm about to say, but I think because the show separates the murder imagery, the murder tableaus, from their context, meaning the murder itself, it makes it more beautiful because it separates us from the victim's agony. It's not interested in showing someone being sliced into 6 equal parts and then displayed in transparent liquid or whatnot. It's not interested in showing us how someone's guts can become string to play them like a violin. We will just see the end result. We will just see the design. We never actually rarely do we see the murders. When we see Hannibal, particularly murder, usually they're like scenes of almost, like you said before, like fighting, right? He's trying to overpower someone and that is never the way that I think he wants to murder people. I don't think that's his approach or his vibe. It's too rushed. But I kept thinking that as much as we see the crimes, we're always mostly seeing them from filtered through will, and therefore we never actually see the murderer commit the murders. So we're just getting the visualization of this design, and again, they become these objects. And because the design, the art production design, because the production design is so over the top and so grotesque, you're so separated from the fact that these are human bodies, because you're like, no, this is a painting, this is an artwork, which in itself is a fucked up way to be looking at a horror TV show, because you're like, wait, why am I now thinking like a serial murderer? It's like, oh yes, it's art with human bodies. No, that's one of the messed up reactions that you can have with this show.
You're so right. And I think that is the key, that there is a huge amount of death in the show. Like the body count is enormous. There's a lot of blood, but there's not a lot of pain. You don't, like you say, you don't see people in agony. Either we see them when they're already dead and they've kind of just become an object, like a still life almost. But yeah, there's really not a lot of the chase, or, there are, that kind of classic horror scene of like, there's a girl in a basement and she's screaming, and we don't really get much of that. And the only times that we do get things like that, actually, it's Will and Hannibal, like the incredibly disturbingly sexy moments where they're sort of like shirtless, covered in blood, hanging upside down, about to be sacrificed.
Yeah.
We see them in pain quite a lot, but we don't actually see the victims in pain.
And I do find it really intriguing the way the show also films sex, because, and maybe this is a moment we can talk about all the numerous romantic and sexual entanglements that we see on this show.
Yeah, none of which feel real apart from Will and Hannibal.
True, and Jack and Bella.
Yeah.
The kind of the straight uncle and auntie for the entire show. But, when every single, the way that the show films bodies, both in death and in sex, feels completely unreal. So every time there's a sex scene, they film it in very different ways, but they are kind of all share this sort of like very like beautiful elongation of the bodies. You know, they become like silk, they become otherworldly, you know, like arms and legs blend into each other to the point where you can't see who it is or whether it's even a human person, and it's all this floaty like tantric sex music, and then cut and you see the two characters you met and like, oh okay, I see, yeah, they were fucking, that's what that was, because they might have been just having a trip or they were having sex, maybe both. But I do find it really curious that with both kind of the huge bodily experiences that we have, both the violent ones and the pleasurable ones, they film them in this very surreal, over the top operatic way.
Yes, and yeah, in the same way that the deaths in the show don't feel real, they don't feel realistic. I mean, I haven't killed someone, but I imagine that that's not very realistic. The sex doesn't feel realistic either. It doesn't seem like anybody comes. It doesn't I don't know if they're enjoying it even. Actually, I might be remembering this wrong, but in my memory, the only time that there's anything that you could describe as like a sex noise or a noise of release or pleasure is when Hannibal stabs Will.
Well,
and he
that makes
lets
sense.
out this kind of grunt, right?
Yes.
And then, like, I guess spoilers for the end, but like the very end is like they make kind of like sexual noises as well. Whereas I don't recall the sex scenes actually having any sort of sexual sounds in them.
They've got like this, they've got music on them, but they don't really have any sounds. So what do you think, outside of Will and Hannibal, and we'll talk about them particularly, I think, when we talk about the ending for the show. And, you know, I'm going to record a full spoiler warning at the beginning because it ended in 2015. Okay, people need to calm down.
Yeah, if you haven't seen it by now, you're not that bothered.
Maybe we'll change people's minds. I don't know. What do you make of the show's different romantic and sexual entanglements? You know, we'll save Will and Hannibal for the end, but there's also Hannibal, Alana Bloom, there's Will and Alana Bloom, there's Margot and Alana, and Hannibal and Bedelia, and obviously we talked about Jack and Bella.
Poor Alana. She's a funny one.
She's messy.
I like that. I saw that in your notes. She is messy. I don't know if the writers really know who Alana is. And so I don't know if we really know who Alana is. I think they're trying to get her to fill a lot of different roles. And I think the thing about Alana is that I think she's kind of meant to be the audience stand-in. I think she's the one that quite often says what we're probably thinking. You know, she's the one that shouts at Jack, "You've put Will in danger and you knew it was damaging him and you did it anyway." She's the one that says to Hannibal, "I thought you were supposed to be treating him. Why didn't you see that he was clearly not in his right mind and he clearly wasn't connected to reality?" She's the one that says these things. So I think she is kind of meant to be us in some ways, that she's meant to feel more real. She actually kind of does feel less kind of operatic and over the top than the rest of the characters. But I think that means she has a certain hollowness to her. There's just not a huge amount of meat, I was going to say. There's not this kind of, she doesn't have this meatiness that the other characters have. And there's this one scene that really bothers me, and it's my Roman Empire. I think about it, I swear, on a weekly basis. There's this scene towards the end of the first season where Will has been imprisoned. They all think that he's a murderer. They're all angry at themselves because they didn't see it coming. And Alana does this kind of silent slow-mo tantrum in her car, which is a scene that we've seen before. We've seen this scene in so many different films and TV shows. Some have like the little tantrum in the car, and it just doesn't work. Like, it doesn't feel right. And I just think a lot of times Alana's emotional reactions, they just don't feel right because I think she's trying to be too many things, meaning that she's nothing.
Yeah, and I do think that she is, not to say that she's my least favorite character, but she's the most inconsistent one. And especially because she sort of has to, as you say, either explain things to us or be a very normal kind of character in a really heightened world. But also she feels sometimes like a super glue by the writers to just fix any plot hole. It's like, oh, that doesn't make sense. Who would do that? How does that character know about this? Oh, Alana will say it to them. It's like, oh, we need a thing. You know, Hannibal needs like a fake alibi. It's like, oh, well, you know, let him fuck Alana like that. Let's do that. And
we need a lady hookup. Let's get Alana. She's a lady.
But then similarly, you know, she then kind of has this massive transformation after Hannibal throws her out the window and she breaks all her hip bones or something. And she suddenly becomes like this villainous character with a cane. And now she's wearing red lips and like has this like power lesbian suit aesthetic that she never had before. I love that, Alana, but also it's such a 180 shift from who she was in the previous 2 seasons. I'm like, oh, this is a completely new character. You've just like hired the same actress to play a completely radically different new kind of role. So I think she is done dirty by inconsistencies and kind of needs to patchwork plot holes so that they're not plot holes.
Yeah, she strikes me as someone whose home life it's quite difficult to imagine, because we see Will at home, we see Hannibal at home, we see Jack at home. I feel like I can imagine the other characters' homes, like I can imagine what their lives outside work looks like. But I have no idea what Alana does at the end of the day. I imagine she just kind of goes into her office and like powers down and then stays there, there until work starts.
Do you know what? She's like did you ever play The Sims?
Yeah.
She's like a Sims NPC. So she, you know, comes in, does her thing, and then she just like, you know, when they sort of in the previous iterations, they would just like disappear. They would sort of leave the neighborhood and you'd watch them and they would just poof. They were gone. That's Alana. Like she just poof disappears when she's not on the screen, and then she turns up again in a different outfit.
Do you want to know something weird? Do you know in World of Warcraft, there is an NPC called Kirsty Logan?
Are you serious?
Yeah. It's nothing to do with me. It's not me. It's a massive coincidence. Isn't that weird?
That's so weird.
I sometimes get emails about it. People being like, I Googled this NPC's name and you came up. Is this meant to be you? And I was like, no, I don't think so.
That's so weird.
Isn't it weird? She lives in Booty Bay.
I kind of love that. And what do you think about Hannibal's other big, in quotation marks, hetero relationship with Bedelia?
Yeah. I am so torn on Bedelia. I really don't like her. And I hate that because, I mean, Gillian Anderson is the queen of all our hearts. I am the biggest X-Files nerd. And I dyed my hair red for like 15 years, which I'm sure is because of Scully. I just love her. I think she's the most beautiful woman in the world. I think she's brilliant. I do not like the way that she plays Bedelia. I don't know if that was her choice as an actor. I don't know if that's what it said in the script. She just seems like really stoned all the time. And that kind of makes sense. Kind of makes sense later on when, you know, she's run off with Hannibal and he's drugging her quite heavily. But she's like that right from the start. It's really strange. I don't like the choice. The one thing I will say, now bear with me. Mm-hmm. I know that we've agreed we're not going to do any more Hannibals. Let's just leave it where it is. However, imagine this. Lesbian remake. She is Hannah Lecter.
Yes.
And then we also have Willa Graham.
Oh my God, yes.
Right, I have got casting choices.
Tell me.
I've been making a list. This is what I did when I woke up at 5 a.m. and couldn't sleep. Alicia Vikander or Emma Stone.
Yes.
Or Karen Gillan.
Yes.
Or Evan Rachel Wood. Or my last choice to really get the lesbians on board, Kristen Stewart.
Yes.
I mean, come on, Kristen Stewart and Gillian Anderson as like murder wives. Come on. That's the only Hannibal further depiction I will accept.
I think I might need like a 15-minute break just to process this.
Call NBC, call Netflix. Let's get it done.
So I'm glad you brought up your reservations about Bedelia, because I'm similarly as confused, because there's like some women in the world that make me go cross-eyed, and Gillian Anderson is one of them. And I'm sure, like, you know, like you, like most everyone who ever watched the X-Files, and she's one of those kind of, I think, genuinely great beauties that has kind of transformed from one kind of beauty to another as she's aged, and she's just as gorgeous now as she was 10 years ago, as she was 25 years ago. And Bedelia, though, I was watching the show and I loved it every time that she showed up. But does she make sense?
No.
But
I mean, I was going to say she doesn't feel real, and we've said none of the characters feel real, but I don't know. She feels unreal in an unsatisfying way.
So I think she's actually quite a tragic character, because I was trying to, she just appears out of like nowhere, you know, she's Hannibal's therapist, and you get like, oh, this is a bit of like beautiful stunt casting. Like even one episode with Gillian Anderson is great. And she looks fabulous, and she's sort of like visually a match for Hannibal, right? Like you can see them looking at you across the bar, you know what I mean? And
oh, come on, don't we all wish?
Literally, just like adopt me, make me into your like weird sex murder baby, I don't care. But there's this weird dynamic between them where I was like, why would you take on someone like Hannibal Lecter as your client? Like, you so clearly are just working with him because you want to fuck him so bad. And then you're going to accept him as a murderer and run away to Italy with him, knowing that he wants to cannibalize you.
Yeah.
But that just means that you get to spend like a few weeks with him.
She like knows he's a murderer right from the start, but isn't willing to kind of do anything about it. Like, she's not helping him to murder more, but she's not helping him to murder less either.
So hear me out. I think this relationship between Bedelia and Hannibal is like a darker version of the Bradley Cooper film Maestro.
I haven't seen that.
So the whole premise of that film, right? It's not brilliant, but it's not bad. But the whole thing that film sets out to explore is the relationship between a gay man and a straight woman who's in love with him. And he loves her, but not in a way that she loves him. And kind of that, can you knowingly go into a relationship with someone who cannot love you in the way that you love them, right? And the kind of the dynamics and the tensions of that, like this can be true love, but it's not a romantic kind of true love. And I think the same way about Bedelia and Hannibal, where Bedelia knows that she is not good enough for Hannibal. He will not see her as an equal. She will be but a plaything until he meets his murder husband, Will. But she's willing to sacrifice her life and her dignity for a little bit of Hannibal's attention. Just a smidge. But she knows, and she's the one who tells the line that I quoted earlier to Will, that she will be pushed aside immediately as soon as Will enters the picture. So there's this like really cloying relationship dynamic between them, but not cloying in a traditional sense. Like, she's not begging anyone, but she's constantly there. She sees him murder people and she's like horrified, but she still stays. The very last shot of the whole series is of Bedelia. And I think we often forget about this because it kind of comes after the credits and after the dramatic mutual destruction of Hannibal and Will. Have you not seen this?
I haven't even seen that.
Oh my God,
I need to go and watch
Kirsty.
it after this. I've missed it.
Oh my God. Thank you for proving my point. So,
oh my God.
I'm going to describe
I just switched it off. I was like, oh, it's finished. Oh my God.
So let me describe it to you. After they throw themselves off the cliff to this gorgeous Siouxsie and the Banshees, isn't it? Love Crimes, the song. I've watched it like 3 times. I just kept rewinding it to see it again. And then it's cut to credits. And then immediately after, we get a shot of Bedelia. And we first see her from the front. Gillian Anderson's boobs just like looking phenomenal in this low-cut sparkly dress. She's dressed up to the nines. She's like, heaving, breathing really heavily. She's like excited. She set the table for 3, right? And the camera pans away and you see that she has served up this giant roasted leg. And then it pans down to her and you see that it's her own leg. She's cut off her own leg at the thigh.
Come on.
She's roasted it. She's served it up. She's like, I can't have you fully, Hannibal, but this is my like offering to you and your murder husband. Like, let's be a murder throuple. Challengers who? Fuck that tame shit. This is the throuple that I'm talking about. That is the last shot of the series.
I cannot believe I've gone this far through my life without seeing that shot.
I cannot believe it.
Thank you for bringing me this gift. What a blessed day. Okay, so, all right. So I understand this show's not coming back again, even though, the Fannibals would be happy with that. But I'm going to say, I would be there. The only version I'll watch is if she is the new Hannibal. She is the new amputee Hannibal. Oh, and yes. She has to find a new person to manipulate.
I think it kind of sets it up for that.
Would watch.
Yes. Well, I think that this might be a good point to discuss Will and Hannibal, and especially the way that the show wraps up their relationship, the ending.
Oh yeah, and we must remember to talk about Bella, because I think she's really interesting as well.
Oh, totally. But let's discuss the ending, and I'm going to wrap it up kind of in a little bit of season 3 and the end of 2, because at the end of season 2, Hannibal sort of sacrifices himself. He surrenders himself. He's about to get caught, but he's like gutted Will. He runs away to Italy with Bedelia first, and then he surrenders himself. He allows himself to be caught. He is deliberately messy. He draws attention to himself. He draws Will and Jack to Florence. He surrenders himself. He's put in jail, primarily, and the show tells us this, so that Will always knows where to find him. Then there's a time jump of 3 years, and Will has got a wife and an adopted son, and they have to interact again. They have to solve the Red Dragon murders together. It's all very tense, seeing your ex for the first time in a couple of years. And in the final episode of the series, they murder Francis Dollarhide. We'll discuss maybe in a little minute. But at the very last scene of them two together, they murder this man together, stabbing him in slow motion, very erotically. And then they're both bleeding, hurt, and they hug. They almost kiss. And then Will sort of gently throws the both of them as they embrace over the cliff into these roaring dark black waters. What do you think of Will and Hannibal's love?
And Hannibal says something like, "This is all I ever wanted for you," and Will says it's beautiful. How I swooned.
This is my Bridgerton.
No, I love it. Yes. Oh my God. Yes. This is my kind of romance novel. Yes. So I love it. Like, I totally agree with you that season 3 is very rushed. Like, it's pretty obvious that Francis Dollarhide should have had a whole season. That should have been season 4, that he was like the big bad that went across that whole season. They went back and forth. They kind of hunted him together. They killed him together. That's how it should have been. But I understand that they didn't get to have that option. And I remember before I had seen it, because obviously as soon as I started watching it, I was obsessed and joined all these fan communities and stuff. So I kind of knew how it ended. I didn't know exactly what was going to happen, but I knew that people felt very cheated and they were saying, oh, it's a shame it sort of ended on this cliffhanger, quite literally. So I was expecting a really unsatisfying ending. And I didn't find it unsatisfying at all. I thought it was the perfect ending. And like I said, I would happily watch another season with Gillian Anderson as what was it? I said Hannah Lecter. I would watch that. But I also think for this plot line, to me, that's the perfect ending, because I think it was set up right from episode 1 that the natural end point for Will and Hannibal is for them to murder together and then die together. It makes sense for their characters, very operatic, very Romeo and Juliet, they die, because that surely is the most satisfying and beautiful end to a romance. Not in real life, but in a story, is for you to die together, because then neither one of you has to live without the other. And I just think it's actually really beautiful. I didn't find it unsatisfying. How about you?
I find it...
It is literally a cliffhanger, but...
Literally, yeah. I find
but also
deeply satisfying. It is the music that comes in, and this is not a show that uses a lot of kind of it doesn't kind of use contemporary needle drops at all. So that song, Love Crimes, coming on, it feels very significant. We see Will and Hannibal try to murder each other, either directly or via other people throughout the show. The whole kind of back and forwards, as you've mentioned before, of Will either being drawn to Hannibal's kind of dark influence or to Jack's more positive influence is a constant. He's the one who's been constantly is teetering on the edge. And I think there's something so deeply earnestly sad about Hannibal in the beginning of season 3 and at the end of season 2, and the cliffhanger for season 2, when he has the big fight with Jack and he kills Abigail and he guts Will, which again is very erotic, when he just stabs him with a short knife and just rummages around in his belly for a while telling him how much he's hurt him and how he gave him a rare gift. He let him see him.
I let you see me.
He rejected it. Fucking hell. I can't.
I mean, how could he? How could he reject Hannibal?
Never reject you, Dr. Lecter.
I let you know me. See me. I gave you a rare gift. But you didn't want it.
Didn't I?
You would deny me my life.
No. Not your life. No.
My freedom, then. You would take that from me. Confine me to a prison cell. Do you believe you could change me? The way I've changed you?
I already did.
I'm Bedelia. I would cut off my own leg to feed it to him. But there is so much all this influence that he so easily wields on other people. He's so easily bored by people, including someone like Bedelia. And I think he really seeks an equal, because I think he even has a lot of these sort of throwaway lines where he says that he's not interested in analyzing sheep, just interested in eating them. He never sees the people that he murders as equals. He might be temporarily interested in some people like Abigail Hobbs, but I think he never sees until Will anyone who can comprehend him wholly. Everything about him, the design of his murders, his aesthetic sensibilities, his psychology. And, he has this line, which I also love from the book, where nothing happened to me, I happened. And that is said in the show as well. And conversely, Will is someone, I think, for Hannibal that he can never fully dissect. He cannot psychoanalyze him very simply. He's constantly titillated by the way that Will's mind operates. And he's so pathetic almost in the 3rd season when he's in his prison and he's he wants Will so bad. And when they finally go to this murder house on a cliff. And he has for a moment, a brief moment, this like glimpse of their pleasant murder husband life together where he just pours some wine and they can talk about some murders. And then fucking Francis comes in and causes mayhem. But
cock blocked by Francis Dolarhyde.
Literally. But then it is such a profoundly satisfying ending. The only thing that would make it better is if they kissed, because I've read subsequent interviews where Mads Mikkelsen that he really wanted that to be the end, that they kiss and then they fall off the cliff. But again, I think Hannibal would have wanted.
Why didn't they kiss?
I fucking hate it. I don't know who to blame.
But
I need someone to blame.
Is there a reason that they didn't kiss?
I don't know. That's my only frustration with it. Like, it is so. The entire show follows the kind of like flirting, falling in love, relationship, breakup, getting back together formula of a rom-com, except it's a horror opera. That the lack of physical intimacy, well, they do have physical intimacy via violence, but never via sex with each other. And you can see, I've watched this scene so many times, you can see that Hannibal sort of like dips his head to go in for a kiss almost. And then Will sort of pushes them both off the cliff. And you're like, oh, are they kissing when they fall? I don't know. That's what I imagine.
Yeah, of course they are. Well, I see what you mean. And I remember when I first watched it, I was like, oh, they should have kissed. I bet that was because, I don't know, you can show a totem pole of dead, naked bodies on TV, but you can't show two men kissing. But I don't know, actually. Thinking about it, it's almost like they've transcended kissing. Like, their relationship is so much more intimate than that level of physical intimacy. Like, they do see each other. And I love that you saying that kind of hits these beats of a romance, because it does. And right, and I'm sure it's like episode 1 that Hannibal comes to Will's house and brings him breakfast and brings him sausages, which are implied to be human sausages. And he says something like, oh, what do you think of me? And Will says, I'm not particularly interested in you. And he says, you will be.
I know. Yes.
And it's such a seduction. Like, I think at first glance, it seems like Will is the weak one and Hannibal is the one that has all the power. But Will has this incredible power over Hannibal right from the start. Like, Hannibal is the one that does the pursuing the entire time.
Yes. He absolutely does. He pulls out all the stops and makes him like a gourmet chicken soup when he's ill.
It smells delicious.
Silky chicken in a broth. A black-bone bird, prized in China for its medicinal value since the 7th century. Wolfberries, ginseng, ginger, red dates, and star anise.
You made me chicken soup.
Yes.
Yeah. It's kind of like, you know, the kind of classic teen romance like Twilight or 50 Shades of Grey, where it's like this incredibly beautiful, powerful, handsome man likes this one person and you're like, why her? But that's what it's like. You're like, why Will? Hannibal's just... He's the most special boy of them all.
Will really is Bella Swan, isn't he?
Right. I'll accept that remake as well.
And, you know, we have to talk about the food a little bit, because it's such a part of that production design that we talked about before, you know. And obviously it's, as we mentioned already before, we're coming into this with a very distinct, very intense knowledge of who Hannibal Lecter is as a character, what he does, you know, that he kills and eats people. So he is the gun underneath the table. He is the bomb under the table, you know, to paraphrase what Hitchcock said about building tension. But we all know that Hannibal Lecter is a cannibal. Do you think that fundamentally changes the way that we watch the cooking and the eating scenes throughout the show?
Oh, yeah, of course, because every time there's anything that looks vaguely meaty, we think, oh, it's a person. And yeah, I think absolutely. And I think the production design of the food is so clever because it all looks so beautiful, but it all looks kind of disgusting as well. Like it doesn't make me want to eat it. It makes me want to look at it, but it doesn't make me hungry. It's all these sort of little, sort of purplish, beautifully arranged things with flowers stuck on them.
Lots of flowers.
They don't look... Lots of flowers, yeah. Lots of kind of, purplish and dark green items with a little bit of red on them. So yeah, they don't make me hungry, but they are incredibly beautiful. And I think that's actually quite a skill to be able to portray food that it doesn't look tasty, but it does look beautiful.
Huge. And it's also, I think, we have a lot of scenes of Hannibal cooking. And I think those are quite key because he loves to throw a dinner party. Much like me, I love to throw a dinner party and cook too many things for my guests. And that's part of the kind of the scene Hannibal in the wild thing that we get with the show, right? We see what it is that is so appealing about him, how gracious of a host he is, how much effort he puts into the display of everything, into cooking something for a dinner party or for a party. We see him throw a party once and he makes every single canapé by hand himself and then hires staff to show them around. And I think that is one of those things that makes it so appealing. He's so insistent in doing everything himself, and it's gorgeous and baroque and over the top, but it's meant to be a delight for all the senses. So both for the taste, for the eyes, and for the smell. And you mentioned this thing in your horror writing course last night. We're recording this on the Tuesday and the writing course is on the Monday, about how smell is used or underused in horror. And I think this show has a huge emphasis on how Hannibal perceives the world, and particularly how keen his sense of smell is. There's several scenes where he smells Will and other people, and the food styling is a part of that, because as you look at these things, you're like, oh, fucking hell, I might not want to eat it, but I do want to smell that.
And you just know Hannibal smells good, and I bet Bedelia smells good as well.
Yes.
I'm just waiting for them to eye me across the bar now. A dream I never knew I had.
Let me tell you, I
love that.
I was introduced to Gillian Anderson at some sort of party that she was throwing for a brand that she owns or represents or something, and I have never been more mortified because the main thing that came to my mind was Bedelia, and I was like, oh, I can't.
I feel like she would be... I think you wouldn't be able to look directly at her. It'd be like looking at the sun.
It was, yeah. Yeah.
I just think I would shrink. Just the ground literally would just open and I would just become a little snail.
Listen, let me tell you, I'm about a foot taller than her and I felt like a tiny, tiny child.
Yeah, I hope I never meet her. I don't think my little heart can stand it. The other thing that I wanted to mention though was Bella, because we have spoken a little bit about Uncle and Auntie in this, about Jack and Bella, and I think Bella is a really interesting character, and that was one thing that I thought was really missing in the Silence of the Lambs film, is that she isn't mentioned in it at all, and she's only briefly mentioned in the book, and she gets such an interesting characterization here. So she is Jack Crawford's wife who is dying of cancer. And it's interesting, I think we're very fond of Hannibal, even though he does so many terrible things. But I have to say, I think the one moment of his that I found really fascinating is that Bella wants to die. She knows that she's terminally ill. She's going to die. She wants him to help her to die peacefully. And he stops her. So he says he will help her, and she begins to die, and then he brings her back, and she's very upset because that's not what she wanted. And I actually think that's the cruelest thing that he does in this entire show. You know, he murders multiple people, and yet the one thing that I thought, oh, Hannibal, you absolute dick, is when he does that to Bella, because she is such an incredibly likable, relatable, sort of unequivocally good character. And yeah, it's such a fascinating thing that he does, and it makes perfect sense for his character. And I think it's a really important scene as well, because I think we get very caught up in him. He's so handsome, he's so charming, he's daddy, he's got this murder husband, we love him. But he is a killer, and he's a psychopath. He has this lack of connection, this lack of care. And in that moment, he looks at Bella as if she's not human, as if she's just this experiment, this thing that he can take away or bring back. And I think it's actually a really important moment, just to remind us of who he is.
He does have a huge capacity for cruelty, and I agree. It's between Bella and Georgia, the character who appears in a couple of episodes, and she murders a few people because she's suffering from this condition that makes her think that she's actually dead. And her kind of whole vision of things is very distorted, and she accidentally witnesses Hannibal while he's on his like little very carefully considered murder spree, and he triggers her. He doesn't kill her himself, but he triggers her death by giving her a comb while she's in this like highly oxygenated cocoon thing, and she burns alive. And it's only because he doesn't even want the possibility of her identifying him.
And that is a moment where we see pain, actually.
Yeah.
Which is quite rare in this show. That we kind of see her dying. And like you said, we don't usually see people die in the show.
And let's talk briefly about some of the other supporting characters that we have. Like, I'm going to divide them between the murderers and the non-murderers. So the non-murderers, one of the most interesting two for me is Freddie Lowndes and Dr. Frederick Chilton. Both very much extended, and in the case of Freddie, gender flipped. What do you think of the way that the show adapts them?
I think it works really well. I really like the character of Freddie. I think she's very interesting, and I think it's still quite unusual actually to see a woman be so ruthless and be so ambitious, because she, kind of like Hannibal actually, she has no human connection. She will say or do anything in order to get the story. She really doesn't care what she does to people's lives. It's just all about getting the story and her ambition. And it was weirdly kind of refreshing, because you still don't get a huge number of female characters like that. So I liked it. I actually thought it really worked. I love her styling as well.
Oh, yes.
She very much, she dresses like she's a sort of PI from the 40s or something. She, again, like very stylized outfits on her. And I like that. And she's got this incredible hair, this like big red curly hair. And she almost looks like a very beautiful cartoon character. Like all her features are quite dramatic. And no, I really like her. She feels ridiculous. She doesn't feel like a real person at all, but in a way that works, I think, in the show. And like Chilton is, such a baddie, such a villain, but in a way that really works, because I think the actor is great and is actually very likable. So then you kind of feel yourself pulled in two different directions, because he's so hateful, and he was so hateful in Silence of the Lambs as well. But yet the actor is really charming as well. But yeah, he's kind of the closest thing to a villain, I would say, even more so than Hannibal.
Well, I love both of their interpretations, and I think it's good to talk about them both together, because Chilton suffers the fate of Freddie Lowndes from the books. He gets captured and tortured by Francis Dollarhide and burned alive, and throughout the series he suffers the most indignities, the most violence, and it's all because he's a villain, but in a sense that he's pathetic and needy and self-aggrandizing and very mediocre. And I think in the world of the show, mediocrity is the most punishable trait. And because he's so bad at everything and so full of himself, that he consistently gets punished. And it is so it escalates so quickly. Like, he gets stabbed, he gets his guts cut out, he survives. He gets shot through the face, he survives. He like gets his lips torn off. He becomes a best-selling author. He publishes a book, and then Hannibal writes an article disputing everything in his book, and he's so offended because he's like, I wrote the book for you to protect you, you bitch. He's like, it wasn't very good though, so like, what do you want me to do? And
he's like, you'll never be Will.
Yeah, and then he like gets burned alive, gets his lips cut off, and he still survives. Like, he's just this husk of a human being. Like, at the end, he's just destroyed. And I agree. The guy who plays him, Raul Esparza, he's like this great Broadway star. So he's so charming in a really sleazy way, and I love him every time he comes on screen, but he does suffer a lot throughout the series.
You're right, actually. Maybe I was a bit harsh on him. He really does get punished more than he deserves, really.
And what about the way that the other serial killers are portrayed in the film? I'm thinking mostly of the Chesapeake, well, not the Chesapeake Ripper, because that's one of Hannibal's alter egos, about Garrett Hobbs. What's his full name?
Garrett Jacob Hobbs, yeah.
I'm thinking specifically of him and Mason Verger and obviously Francis Dollar-Hyde.
Yeah, I think that the most of the killers in the first season, we only kind of see them for a couple of scenes because they're sort of introduced for one episode and then it's solved very quickly within the episode. So they don't really get a lot of chunky screen time. And Mason Verger, he's a funny one. Like, this was the same when we talked about him in the film, that he's such a ridiculous character. Like, he's this guy who feeds his own face to a dog and then, you know, eats orphans' tears, and he is so camp, but like, he suits the tone of this show. Like, I think he didn't suit the tone of the film because it was trying to be too serious, whereas in this, he fits perfectly into the very kind of gothic, heightened tone of season 2. And season 2 isn't my favorite because I think it just kind of gets a bit up its own bum, but he suits it though. Like, he's such a ridiculous villain, and I love Michael Pitt. I think he's great, and he's so beautiful as well, that to have him play this character works really well. Yeah, I actually think he plays it a lot better than Gary Oldman does. Even though usually I do like his hammy acting. It works for me.
I do think he really borrows Gary Oldman's voice stylings from Hannibal the film for Mason, but he's by all accounts allegedly an absolute prick to work with, and I think that prickishness.
No.
Yeah, notoriously so. I think that's why he got killed off on Boardwalk Empire. Spoilers. And also why he got recast in season 3 as Mason Verger.
Oh, I didn't know that. Well, that's good to know. I'll cross him off my imaginary dinner party list.
But I do love how Mason is genuinely a deeply unpleasant character. He is vicious. He is sort of like, we never see him do anything, but we know, and it is said that he sexually assaults his sister Margot. He is horrendously abusive to her. He's a pedophile too, you know. And
doesn't he like put her egg in a pig or something? Am I remembering that right? Did I dream that?
No, that happened.
Yeah.
So first of all, we don't see it, but it is said that's why she goes to Hannibal. He assaults her. Then he causes her to have an accident and forcibly gives her hysterectomy because she got pregnant by Will. And then he takes out her eggs and what's the proper word? Grows a fetus that he implants in a pig to carry. So it's like an ultimate humiliation. And all of this is preceded by him toying with her and telling her, well, you know, I may have taken away your oven, but I have maintain the buns, and would you like to see them? So I'm very sorry for that metaphor. It's the first that came to mind. And sorry about that. And he kind of leads her on to things like, well, you know what, but you know, I took your eggs, and there's a baby, like there's a verger baby now. Would you like to meet your baby? And then it's this, semi-alive pig that's holding a child inside of it. It's disgusting. However, Mason does get his comeuppance because Margot, Hannibal, and Alana sodomize him with a cattle prod, get his sperm.
Oh, yeah.
Alana carries that baby. They get all the money. And also Margot kills Mason with his own eel, which is what also happens in the book. Fucking love this show.
I don't love that season. I don't know. I don't love that season. To me, I'm like, I was really with you with the murder husbands. I was with you with these like still life, bizarre, beautiful, bloody, artistic death scenes. But I'm like, the eel, the cattle prod up the butt, the pig. I'm like, it's not my vibe. I don't know. I wasn't sure about that whole. I seem to have like blocked that whole part out of my mind because I just found it quite distasteful. There we go. I'm being like Hannibal. I'm like, the worst thing is to be rude. The worst thing is to be distasteful.
I think you're absolutely right, though. It is distasteful, and I think that's why Mason is framed so differently as a character and as a killer. Because he is gross. He's not actually a killer. He's just a cunt. Like, he is just an asshole. And everything about him is so offensive. Even to Hannibal, who, like, the way that he stares daggers at him when he, like, ruins his therapist chair. Frame that still. Put it in the Louvre. My God.
Yeah, that's true. Because I actually find Francis Dolarhyde a kind of strangely sympathetic character. Whereas you're right, when it comes to Mason, there's nothing sympathetic about him. So yeah, maybe that was really good casting, actually, if he's a prick as well.
Let's talk a little bit about Francis, who, much like in this episode, the show compresses into far little amount of time. He only gets about 6 episodes, the second half of the 3rd series. And he's played by Richard Armitage. What do you think? He's been portrayed twice before in movies. What do you think of his performance and the way that the show frames him?
It's a shame because he's kind of in the shadow of Ralph Fiennes, because I really did like his portrayal. I thought he did a really good job, and the fact that he's so kind of classically handsome, I think worked really well for the character. And I actually liked the portrayal in Manhunter as well. I thought it was really creepy and really good. So I think, yeah, he was a tricky one because he's kind of in the shadow of 2 good performances. And I think, unlike Mads Mikkelsen, who really had the time and the space to make the role his own, he kind of didn't get as much time to really do that. So I found him a little bit forgettable, but not terrible. I think he just needed more space. He needed a full season, really. I think that was probably the original intention.
Yeah, I'm sure it was, and it was, forcibly compressed into the last season. But I actually really, really liked Armitage's portrayal, mainly because I really like what he was doing with the voice, the way that Francis sounded, because a big thing in the book is about how he has a cleft palate and he has to get surgery, and he's very self-conscious about the way that he speaks. And Ralph Fiennes sounds like Ralph Fiennes, doing an American accent.
That's true.
There's not that much detail in the voice. There's a lot of his performances in the physicality of him. And I think Armitage really, particularly in some scenes with Reba, gets this way of speaking that is not, it's very articulate, but it feels very insecure. Like he's rehearsed certain words to avoid certain sounds, like S or P, and he avoids that. And that felt very, very intentional. And also because of the nature of the show and their focus on a killer's fantasy life, we really get the combination of Francis's internal perspective on himself and the world, the way that he visualizes the dragon, the way that he sees the dragon as almost like this creature that he's becoming, but that also is sort of controlling him in a way, and versus what is actually happening, which is a man, you know, struggling with these murderous impulses and with a history of abuse by the people, which is only really hinted at in the show. But I love these images of him seeing himself with these giant William Blake red dragon wings on his back, and when he gets murdered by Hannibal and Will, there's the shot of them stabbing this huge dragon creature, and I love that.
And yeah, you're right. And actually that tonally fits really well with the rest of the show, because like you say, there's this real focus on the fantasy of the act and the fantasy of killing, and how Will can really get inside that. He can get inside that kind of dream world. And there's also, I thought it tied in really beautifully to all this imagery of the stag, that Will has all these kind of visions or images of himself like growing these enormous stag horns and these kind of strange creatures, and he has all these nightmares about this kind of stag creature. So yeah, I actually think it ties in really nicely, and it really emphasizes this idea that Will potentially is not that different than the killers that he's hunting. And, you know, there's that classic line, "We're not so different, you and I." Mm-hmm. And I think rather than, they do use that line, but I think the way that it's shown visually works really well. That, like you say, Francis Dolarhyde is kind of inhabiting this fantasy world. And that is exactly what Will does as well. Mm-hmm. That we have all these scenes of him kind of, and we see him kind of enacting this crime in this very heightened way. And then Jack or someone will kind of snap him out of it. And then we see the reality that he's just a guy sitting there thinking, you know, sort of like deep in his fantasy. So yeah, I think it really strengthens that link as well.
And before we wrap up our chat on Hannibal, do you have anything else about the show that you wanted to share that we might not have covered yet?
Just hire me to write the lesbian remake. That's all.
Kirsty, thank you.
That's all I need.
So much. I can't wait to see your lesbian remake about Hannah Lecter.